Good morning, everyone. I am the industry lead for healthcare and financials at the New York Stock Exchange. Thank you so much for joining us today. Some of you may have been surprised to see the New York Stock Exchange hosting a discussion on the future of genomics. It's true that the NYSE is known for a world-famous trading floor where billions of shares trade each day and where capital markets literally come to life. But it's also a vibrant community of innovation, entrepreneurs and companies filled with incredible people that are shaping the future from biological to digital and everything in between. Now, 20 years ago, I was working on HIV gene therapy. The progress made since then has been absolutely amazing, and it's accelerating. In light of that progress and what the world is dealing with today especially, I'm really excited to be able to tap into that incredible NYSE community and hear our expert panelists discuss the future of genomics, a field that will have enormous impact on our lives. Speaking of our panelists, they have generously volunteered their time to join us today. Their views reflect their own personal perspectives and are not intended to represent those of their current and or prior employers. So I'd like to be the first to thank them for volunteering their time. Now with that, let me introduce you to Dr. Chris Waller, Chief Scientist at EPAM. All yours, Chris.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric, and welcome to the panel on genomics today, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon. And fortunately, you don't have to listen to me speak the entire time because I'm joined by three key opinion leaders that I've pulled together to help explore this giant topic that we're going to touch on today. So today I have Hal Stern, VP and CIO of R&D at Janssen. I've got John Apathy, the Vice President of IT for Research and Early Development at Bristol-Myers Squibb, and I've got Mark Grodman, CEO of Genosity, joining me to really talk about some large issues related to the future of genomics. And I think everyone here will agree that we've seen tremendous, as Eric pointed out, tremendous advances in science and technology related to genomics over the past several years, and we've seen that acceleration. Those of us that work in life sciences and healthcare have seen genomics power new target identification and validation efforts in early discovery. We've seen genomics provide novel biomarkers in preclinical and clinical studies. We've seen genomics give us the ability to target medications to individuals that are most likely to respond in trials and in real-world settings, and so on and so on. But it's my hypothesis today that we're only beginning to realize the full power of that genomics harnesses, that has, and that we're still hampered in the fact that we've got siloed databases, siloed processes, keeping us from sharing and taking full advantage of the information that genomics is giving us. I further will propose that I think that if we get this right, that genomics, given that it underpins our early discovery through outcomes efforts, could be that digital thread that we're looking for to connect not only the data, but the processes and the workflows across that continuum. So with that as a backdrop, I want to jump into the panel discussion and start the discussion with Hal Stern and give him an opportunity to follow up on a discussion that he and I had when I invited him to join the panel related to the criticality of appropriate informed consent, data privacy procedures and policies related to the collection, the sharing, and the utilization of genomic data. And I'll point out that many of us saw a reasonably recent episode on 60 Minutes where there's an unprecedented research collaboration that's been put together by 23andMe and the folks at GSK. And that collaboration is giving GSK scientists access to massive quantities of genomic data that was collected by 23andMe. And it's opened a lot of questions related to the data privacy informed consent angle. And I wanted to give Hal an opportunity to tell us a little bit about what he does at Janssen and then respond or carry this discussion a little bit forward. So Hal, what are your thoughts?
Great, thanks, Chris, and thanks to Eric and the rest of the panelists. So my role at Janssen is to have end-to-end responsibility for everything systems-wise, technology systems-wise, from early discovery, so target identification and validation, through our entire lab operations, preclinical, clinical, safety, regulatory, quality, in-market surveillance. And as you can imagine, genomics as an evolving discipline weaves its way in and out, as do many other data disciplines. And I think we're sort of at the cornerstone now of three really important trends. The first is we sequenced the human genome well over 20 years ago. And I think at that point, people were saying, well, if we have that and we have really great search capabilities, the drugs will just magically fall out of that. And I'll come back to this point in a minute because it's really, really hard. It's not just the breadth of the data and the depth of the data, but the search space itself is exponentially large. If you try to enumerate it, something like 10 to the 60th compounds and proteins you could possibly be looking at, you're not going to just magically go search the answer unless you have an exceptionally large computer, and even then it will take you millions of years. So start with a view of, well, what do we do with all this data? Where's it coming from? And there's a great article published by Tim O'Reilly called "Sand is the New Data." And he talks about how people are increasingly associated with their data. We see a lot of backlash now in the social media space, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google area, where people are realizing that by providing data about themselves, they're creating these social media products. And so he ran an interesting thought experiment. So, well, what's that data worth? Should you be paid for use of your data? In the case of something like Facebook, it's a $70 billion company with 2.5 billion active users every month, runs at roughly 25% profitability. It turns out that your annual value of your data to Facebook is about $7.50 a person globally. It's a little higher in the US. It's about a little over $30 per person in the US. So do you want to get paid for that? It's not, for a lot of people, it's not a meaningful amount of money. However, you really do care that your data is used in appropriate and meaningful and non-privacy invading ways. So the first conversation is, how do we start to shift our thinking around, well, if I own all this data, if this data describes me, and it always is patients. We can look at this as a sequence of data or a large number of data sets, but those are real people on the other end of those data sets. How is it we start to rethink the way that we look at individual pieces of data, but also how we bring them together? And everybody who has one of these, you have a built-in health tracker. You also have a built-in location sensor, which means it can tell how fast you're moving. It also, so it knows something about my heart rate. It knows something about my musical preferences, and it knows how fast I'm going. Individually, who cares? Taken together, that matters a lot, because now you know that I listen to angry Norwegian death metal while driving 70 miles an hour with an elevated heart rate during the morning rush hour. And that becomes, it's very privacy challenging, to me at least, because I don't necessarily want my insurance company or my employer or even Apple Music to know that about me. So how do we start to bring these things together in a way that allows the data to be remixed? So while we've heard that sand is the new data, and 7 or 8 years ago we heard that data is the new oil, I will propose that data is actually the new music. And we have to think very carefully about how we bring the different data sets together, how we ascribe rights to them, how we respect the rights holders, the individuals who are represented by the data, as well as the companies that curated and pre-processed and joined those data sets together. The second part of this is, as we start to look at these challenges of bringing data sets together and applying machine learning to it, one of the first things you do when you're building a machine learning model to try to decipher or discern some patterns here is you think about how you're going to vectorize your problem. What are the dimensions of it? I'll argue that those dimensions very, very closely align to those things that we find to be private, those things we find to be personal, those things that might be personally identifiable in our data. So as we start to build these models, we want to really know three things. Number one is, are they appropriately capturing the entire range and breadth and depth of the data we have? Number two, are they fair? Are they equitable? Are they non-biased in what they do? And the third thing is, are they really capable of handling all the variations and, in some cases, deficiencies of the data and what we're looking for? So I have a prop. This is it's a template that if you actually wear this over your face, I can see through my glasses, it fools every known available facial recognition software. I show up instead as I look like a street sign with that on, because it's interpreted as a series of numbers. You say, well, what on earth does that have to do with genomic data? A lot of the things we're looking for are exactly like that. They are adversarial inputs to the machine learning systems we build. Failures in human biology, failures in our body's regulatory mechanisms are, in fact, our body's inability to process and react to and identify certain types of defects or pathogens. And we've seen this most recently with the coronavirus, where we've engineered vaccines to improve our body's immune system ability to recognize this new form of virus. We have to make sure that the systems we are building that are genomics based understand that they're looking for things that may in fact try to hide from the normal search mechanism that the body has. So again, how do we assign the appropriate rights to our data and respect them? How do we look at the issue of remixing the data appropriately? And as we remix it and build models to go search it or make predictions on it, how do we assure that they are respectful of the rights, they properly represent the breadth and depth of the data, and that they're sensitive to the fact that we're often operating in these areas that are very, very ripe with adverse events and adverse inputs?
Thank you for your views on that. I think we discussed previously the notion of a healthcare data marketplace where people would take control of their own data and push it into a market and figure out how they could provide selective access to people, or companies, whatever they want to use it. And you touch on some of the critical components to that kind of a future. John, thinking about, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to some of what are your thoughts on this whole notion around data privacy and informed consent as well?
What I would say is that, I agree with Hal completely. One of the challenges we face, of course, is putting the capabilities and linking them together to unlock the opportunity in the face of that complexity. And one of, a simple example of one of the challenges is, our informed consents tend to be paper-based, right? And they tend to be very distributed out into a clinical research network that are very, it's very fragmented across many IRBs and academic research centers. And so even making that digital and getting to an e-consent has been a challenge for the industry. And it's one of those things that I think is something that we should work on together in a pretty competitive way and try to solve that at the industry level, not at the company level.
Genosity is a producer of, large amounts of genomic data, right? So what are your views on the notion of data privacy and informed consent as well?
Well, I think one has to understand the ecosystem of who gives consent and where it comes from. Where is information and who does it? So yes, you talk about informed consent for clinical trials. It's often something that is done outside of the normal flow of diagnostic genomic testing, and it gets to be kind of cumbersome. There are companies that try to do e-consent, but there was no unified platform. But when you think about the genomics ecosystem and the continuum, you're going a lot more than just e-consent. And you talk about data privacy and who owns it. There is a problem because the value of genomics is not going in and looking at 3.6 billion base pairs in a genome. The issue is to be able to look at it and look at clinical conditions, people, problems, who gets sick, who doesn't, who can respond, who are drug targets in a conscientious, ethical, and de-identified manner. But to do that, you need more than that. You need other information. You need clinical information. You need other kinds of information that go beyond clinical and genomics. So how do you really do that? Well, you're right to talking about GSK and 23andMe. Now, just think about that for a second. What you see behind me are sequencers. It's what I think both Hal and John deal with all the time, which are looking at base pairs. What you're dealing with 23andMe is genotyping, a far less discrete analysis that's being used. You're looking at a business which is really direct to consumer, whereas you had in the 60 Minutes piece, people will go in and sign and say, do what you want with what I have, and they provide information to them and basically give consent in that manner. But when you do something for a number of reasons on a population basis, what you're really looking for is a lot of normal people. And my two colleagues on the screen with me are trying to find ways to go affect people who, not the normal part of their lives, but the part where they are dealing with disease burdens. That takes a more stratified population. So where do you find that? Who's doing sequencing now? And who has that information? It's kind of hard to just do it on the DTC approach. Well, health systems do. And there are some health systems that are able to build biobanks to be able to go in and collect data for different groups. By and large today, there is no economically sustainable model for a biobank. The only one we have is government funded. It's called All of Us, looking for 1 million genomes. Where that goes, how it's collated is still very, very much up in the air, as well as the follow-up of people to go give follow-up to it. So there are a lot of laboratories that do diagnostic work. Think about in the last 20 years, and that was where I spent most of my life, in generating tests, whether it be looking at tumors, whether it be looking for inherited cancers, looking about the proclivity for young people to go in, or children to be able to have developmental disorders, looking at exomes as a part of looking at rare and ultra rare disorders. Those are very often done at clinical laboratories, none of which have consent. They're just providers. And when they provide back results, do you know how they provide them back? In PDFs. So what we have is that, yes, it has to be respected. My God, it has to be. But we are so far along in developing the utopia that I think that Hal started to talk about, which maybe started about when you harken back to say, oh my God, we have a genome, to an ecosystem where we have valuable clinical information that can, in an de-identified way, be able to be used not only for discovery, for new therapeutics, but also to improve care by knowing who can get better, who cannot get better. And this is something that we live in, and the challenge of it. In so many ways, once you get beyond the hype and get involved in the detail of it. So the challenge is consent is only part of it, but you need to understand the ecosystem in which it lives.
Perfect. Thank you for that, guys. I'm going to switch gears for a minute. You guys hit on the notion that we're generating, huge amounts of data that we've really not seen before in terms of the depth and breadth of information that we're getting about normal and not normal states of people and populations and cells. And it's really opened up a world of opportunities for big companies, small companies to do really creative things, right? As we learn to manipulate the data, to mix the data, as Hal pointed out, in interesting ways. There are all sorts of insights that we extract from these data sets. And John and I were having a discussion prior to this around, just the big topic of innovation. And we're both fans of the book. Thanks for John. John turned me on to this Goliath's Revenge book, the notion that innovation happens in small companies, but is taken advantage of by large companies. And I'm interested, John, in thinking about, from your perspective as a large company, how are you viewing innovation, and where are you seeing some of the more interesting things happening in the genomic space?
Thanks for the plug to my good friend Scott Snyder's book, Goliath's Revenge. Recommended to everyone on the call. Established companies turn the table on digital disruptors, which I think is a poignant title for what we're facing with the genomic revolution. What I would say is that I came across it because I was looking for a blueprint and for a model how we can respond to essentially what is the disruption of the pharmaceutical industry with the availability of genomic and phenotypic data, and the opportunity that creates is tremendous, and we're living it daily. One of the things as I turn back to the title for this talk, bench to bedside, sounds such a simple premise, but in fact, it's not a genetic thread that's connecting us. It's a giant pipe of data that's coming through with all the complexity that Hal and others have talked about already on this call. And that giant pipe of data is full of haystacks that scientists on a daily basis are sorting through to find the needles. And part of our challenge is to reduce that. And I think that's the disruptive opportunity if we think about our industry. And some of the models that have been given to us by other industries, whether it's in finance or in the automobile industry, I would look for the analogies that matter to us as we think about this digital disruption. And I think self-driving and autonomous cars might be a pretty good, we've been developing data, they've been developing data on those, and these cars have been fully censored up and the data's been collecting. One of our challenges, as we think about making use of genomic data is that we're kind of working with a half-censored car. We're trying to create, data sets that feed machine learning, but we don't have all the data, and it's not complete, fully actionable. And so what's missing? Oftentimes, it's the connectivity between the genomic data, the phenotypic outcome or biomarker data, and then the clinical outcome. And so I think for this to be truly the golden age of human biology, and for us to kind of finally, live up to the promise of the sequencing of the human genome, we need that complete data. And our trouble in pharma is our 30 years of investment in IT in our systems have led to fragmented systems and fragmented data. We don't have kind of all the standards and tools that we need to bring that data together in a very facile way. And so in many ways, I would argue we're an industry ripe for disruption. And in fact, we've got small biotech, in our industry who are doing that in a very targeted way. They're either disrupting at a single target or gene level, or they're disrupting across in a platform approach. And so we, larger pharma have to look at that and respond. How do we respond to those disruptors? And there's work to be done across the spectrum of our data, and focusing on data is one of the things that we intend to do as we think about making that data more actionable and machine ready.
Yeah, and Chris, if I could add on to that, I think you bring up a great set of points. If you think about self-driving cars, they depend upon this sort of centimeter scale resolution building of maps. So we understand where the streets are and where things are on the streets. And then it's a series of route finding algorithms on top of that. We have some part of that mapping done. Again, we have a map of the genome. What we're lacking is that centimeter resolution of the context around it. Are the streets one way? Are they under construction? How do we identify defects in them? And in doing that, I think this large company and small company, I don't think of it as an either or, I think of it as a both and. The technology is rapidly sedimenting. I spent 25 years in the technology industry, and the only thing you knew is that whatever you built now is likely going to be available cheaper, faster, better, in the market within a few years. So how do we use the scaling of our technology to amplify our ability to do science? Because at the end of the day, given the size of the space, it has to be scientists fundamentally prosecuting the scientific method, form a hypothesis, run an experiment, measure the results, do it again. We're not going to replace that with AI. We just aren't. Again, the problem space is too big, and when there are too many unknowns, and you said our understanding of biology, whether you think it's 1% or 3%, it's still small single digits, and we have to get better at that. So we have this opportunity as a set of large companies to bring scientists and to bring tooling to it, and then working with a series of small companies to understand how that tooling is evolving. I really do think it has to be both.
So I think it's interesting, right? I'm going to let Mark come in a minute, but I want to make a comment about self-driving cars, because I think the analogy is a fun one, right? And if you think about self-driving cars that are filled with sensors and they're constantly collecting data and they're doing something to analyze the data and then taking action and doing something different, like not running into a fire hydrant or whatever. I think it's interesting to take that analogy to the level of a person. And is a person as aware as a self-driving car, right? And are we collecting the data at the level that we're actually able to make better personal choices about things that we do based on our environment, our ecosystem, whatever? So it's a fun analogy. I argue that people are not that aware. They're not collecting the data. They're not provided the data or the analytics in a way that allows them to make the choices that they might necessarily want to make, such as self-driving cars do. That's just my opinion. Mark, what are your thoughts?
About self-driving cars, I'm not ready for it at all. If there are two elements of what I think we're talking about. One has to do clearly with the silos. I mean, I've seen them, lived with them, silos with them, those people who have consent, meaning health systems, physicians, and those networks, and other entities that have it to be able to piece it together. There are a number of them. But the other part that I really want to talk about, it's not really technology, it's more of the informatics. AI is a really hot term. We hear about it all the time, how it's going to solve things. I think it was the CEO of NVIDIA I heard who talked to define AI as software dealing with software. So the title of your talk is Go from the Bedside. Now think about this. You need clinical information, right? Both Hal and John said you need clinical information. It's a record. That's a patient, gender, age, sex. How about a diagnosis? How about some other findings for there? How about some laboratory values? Not genomic data, just laboratory values, 70% of the EMR, and other data points. Now let's get that into a lab, into a sequencer, okay? Sequencer generates data. The ones behind me, they want to do a genome. Depending on the depth of what we're talking about, it's anywhere from 40 to 140 gigabytes per genome. The exome could be about 8, depending on the depth of what you're looking for. Looking for tumors more than that. So now you're spitting out a whole bunch on this of data, a lot of data. Now you need to go in and figure out, now I need to get a filter. Meaning I got all this data, I need a pipeline, and I want to go with that. I want to know, what do I really have to go look at? This is all informatics. Because not every pipeline, one size doesn't fit all. Now I got a pipeline. Okay, great. Now I got to analyze them, so they have to be in a format where someone is going to go analyze it, right? This is software. This is programming. Then you need to go decide, who does this go back to? The clinician? Because I got to tell you, not everyone is schooled to do this. So you need people to do it. Does it go back to the research core? Who does it go back to? So now you have that data. It's informatics. It has to go back to generate, in essence, meaningful data. That's a report. Be nice if you then get that back to a patient so he knows what he's getting. But then the other part of it is, now what about going back in and linking that to what you got at the very outset with who the patient was? My point is that in the world we live in, people say, my God, this is an AI company. Oh my God, this is incredible. This is an informatica software company. There's no value there. The reality is that genomics and informatics are inextricably intertwined. And you can't do one without the other and know how to be able to do it. So before one even gets to breaking down the silos, you have to know that the systems really are only starting to be in place to be able to do the analysis and merge the data. And being inside this world, that's what I always thought were the two major challenges.
The data we're dealing with, a lot of the data science and certainly the large database systems come from this world where we could think about putting our data into very neat row major or column major tables. The data we're dealing with is not at all tabular in nature. It is not a matrix. It is a graph. It is a series of fuzzy or fuzzier relationships. We're going to walk those relationships in much more complex ways. And as we learn about the data, and again, we're able to do this stroll, if you will, from biomarkers to target prediction to activity, all the way out to clinical outcome. We're going to learn more and more about what those mapping activities look like. And again, I think the tools we've historically used here, the sort of thinking of this as mastering or standards, are going to break a little bit because I don't know. If I knew the question to ask, I'd say, okay, here's the standard for representing the data. I'm not sure we know all the questions to ask. So our ability to express the standards is going to evolve. And it's a great time to be involved in this. But if you go back 40 years to the early days of the internet, there were no standards for video streaming. There were no standards for security. There were no standards for how you exchange passwords because no one had ever really thought that would be a thing that you would have to do. And we had this remarkable activity that happened in standards bodies that benefited the entire industry, and as a result, benefited the entire user population of the internet. Several billion people now benefit from a number of engineers coming from DEC and Xerox PARC and Sun and HP and other companies that honestly aren't around anymore because they figured out how to go drive the appropriate representations. But it was an evolutionary process. It wasn't just okay, we think this is what it's going to look like. Otherwise, we would not have this video conference right now because that technology at scale is only the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and reinforce one of Mark's point about, and I spin it a little bit differently, which I say value talent over technology. And technology is evolving so quickly that, I'm part of a technology organization. As IT, we, of course, focus heavily on technology. But by focusing on talent, I think, it allows us to step back. And we think about the series of waves that have come across our industry to take advantage of data. One of them was translational medicine, right? Where we're trying to connect, the basic science of the disease to what we're seeing in the clinic to the therapeutic. And translational medicine, I would say, was a little bit ahead of its time in the sense that it didn't have the data in the scientific disciplines of data scientists and computational researchers. So, 15, 20 years ago, there were whole organizations being set up that were starved for information in our industry in pharma. And so now the data is catching up. And so the talent that we're really valuing are the data engineers, the data scientists, the bioinformaticians, the computational researchers. And they're the ones that we need to enable. And just like we built buildings and labs for lab-based scientists, we need to build capabilities in virtual environments for our computational scientists. So that's one of our challenges in the complexity of managing the data across all the ownership issues and the privacy and the cybersecurity, but setting those scientists free and almost giving them tools that allow them to pursue research in an unfettered way and allow innovation to happen. That is the crux of one of our challenges in the industry. So finding ways to solve for that. The other talent we're missing is the discipline of information management. So good old-fashioned enterprise information management, where we've got discipline of data governance and information modeling and standards implementation. And so, I would argue that we're years behind, say, the finance industry, because a dollar means a dollar, whether it's here or in Asia, and they have to manage that down to the penny. Here, we don't have those kinds of standards. And so, J&J has a standard, VMS has a standard, but it's not the same standard. So information model for genomics and other biomarker and clinical data. So those are the sorts of things we I think need to tackle as well.
You want to build a house, you want to build a vision, you want to build a city, and you walk into a yard and you see all these incredible pieces. One better, more applicable, more greater than others. Some of them are behind bars, some of them lack access, some of them are freely available, and you need to put them together. And for those of us who've lived with this, who see the promise, the frustration is, how do you go link it all together and build it? How do you do it? There are a lot of, and there are, just to confirm the points, you have a lot of people who are great masons and woodworkers and electricians, and they can do that, but they still need to go work toward that overarching vision of what has to happen. So the frustration is as great as the vision. So the first step is to understand what are the missing pieces.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? It's like and Hal alluded to this, it's like the early days of the internet, when we were trying to connect a bunch of different things together and make them communicate in some meaningful way. And I think about this healthcare, life sciences ecosystem that we live in, that's made up of payers, producers, providers, patients in the middle, all surrounded by regulators. They all have to communicate in some meaningful way. And we've learned how to move data, like clinical trial data and reimbursement data, other things like that. There are standards that control the movement of data through those networks. And we certainly lack the standards in the genomic space right now to allow the data to move freely between all of those players in that ecosystem in a way that can be consumed, integrated, and understood, right? And I think that clearly in that stack, there's a standard challenge. There's also, as John pointed out, an upskilling or a challenge too, right? We're giving broader access to more in-depth information and data to people that don't really know what to do with it right now. So we're having to think about, how do we upskill our workforce? How do we actually get information out to the clinician that makes sense to them in a genomic way? So it's a fascinating time to be in the space. Mark, you and we've been working together for a number of years now to build out a system that powers your genomic sequencing capabilities. And you've got some views and you've expressed some of them, but I want to let you expand on them a bit around how can we really truly democratize the access to the data that we need to allow everyone to make and take full advantage of all of this wealth of information that we're generating.
I agree with what Hal said. You need to work out consent. Consent has to be done, whether it comes from the person or whether it comes from the health system who's trusted as part, of their care, for which they give consent. and they trust those entities to go give them in a reasonable, ethical manner. So that's going to be number one. Number two, you need to be able to own your own data. Remember, every diagnostic test often goes to entities to which there is no data, and you get back PDF results. Or you have pharma companies who are least equipped to go do it, be in the business of getting informed consent, which John mentioned is, if at best, a cumbersome process. And you deal with that, and that's only for limited for what you're doing over at that time. So the ecosystem truly has to change. The other thing is that it needs to be more cost effective. You can do a lot of tests and generate a lot more information, but for that same cost, you can generate a lot more data if it was in a more reliable, ethical ecosystem where you can go use it and people get consent for it. The world has to be in a different place because we're too segmented. And there's too many people focusing on tests for one limited area, which could be charged more than what it would be to be able to do a lot more data that would have more potential value down the line. So the whole process has to become more efficient, more effective. You don't need, if you're in a hospital, different sequencers and different labs for what to say basically the same process. Because it's the informatics that's different, not the sequencing. If you look behind me, there are things we do here for cancer, for all kinds. It's just data. It's the analysis that makes it different. So it needs to be a far more cost-effective system than what it is.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but Mark, do you see the driving down the unit cost of sequencing a genome? Do you see that as kind of the triggering, event or the triggering mechanism by which then is going to expose the other costs that need to come down as well?
The problem you have is that it depends on who pays for the test. Mm-hmm. If it's right now, direct to consumer means the consumer pays. Right now, we know by history, they're not paying very much. When you look at what pharma companies will do for clinical trials, they will do that. And they sometimes will go in and, I'm not sure, they often sometimes pay a lot of money for tests otherwise would be done because their data needs with it and the controls they need with it are so high, those will go beyond just the cost of the test. When it comes out to the rest of the market, who pays for the test? Well, for many of the diagnostic tests, it's going to be insurance companies. And they often will go in and squeeze down on reimbursement. And I know this because I did sequencing in more clinical areas than anywhere. Mm-hmm. And that process is getting even lower, which is why most independent laboratories that do just genetic testing all lose money. There's got to be a realignment of goals. There's got to be a realignment of value. And the costs have to come down to a point where you say, you know what, we can generate the data, we know what to do with it, and it's not going to be something that people have to take an incredible loss just to be the entities that can help efficiently, responsibly, and ethically administer and monitor and be a custodian of the data on behalf of the patient.
Right. And I think those are the things that become, as the technology goes through the price performance curve and the price quality curve, it is exactly those attributes of how we intersect with the patient population that become the value add. And that's how you will make money, is that you have the ability to enforce meaningful use. You have the ability to allow people to trace their data through a system. I frequently make the analogy of your healthcare data and recycling. Everybody wants to recycle because it's good for the environment. It's the right thing to do. And we sort of have gotten to the point where we can do a pickup of commingled and paper stream recycling, and magic happens on the other end. We don't have to worry about doing all the pre-work ourselves. On the other hand, if you knew that by putting all of your bottles into recycling, once a week someone would post an Instagram picture of whether you drink good wine or bad wine, recycling suddenly less interesting. So there's a value in having a scalable local pickup in that it's also privacy preserving. The window at which your privacy could be invaded is so small because you have exactly one point of presence for it. And I think there are lots of analogies we need to draw from of where do we want to assert these certain characteristics of and social requirements and contracts around our data, and that people will people will pay for that because they're getting value back in terms of understanding how the genetic testing, the genomic information, the overall sequencing information informs their personalized healthcare journey.
A super discussion. Just one of the questions that came in from one of the registrants was related to the notion of, with the decreasing cost of genomic sequencing, do we see a trend toward more of these centralized processing facilities with super high throughput and super low margins? And then, or do we see more decentralization of the testing? And I guess, Mark, you're pretty well positioned to think about that, right, as one of the smaller labs.
Well, even though we have a sequencing lab behind us and we do specialized work, that's more of a proof of concept. We're not in my old life, I had commercial sequencing laboratories in cancer, ultra-rare disorders. We did, at the time, more exomes than any laboratory in the world. All of that was clinical. We did all kinds of work at that point. They had to deal with insurance payments. This is not. I mean, we're an informatics company building an enterprise software and genomics. We do what we do here only is exclusively for pharma work. But, when you look at what centralized laboratories, depends on the volume and who's going to do that. And that's not where we are right now. There are no democratized central laboratories that go in and do it. There are bits and pieces all over, and all of them have to deal with their own volume limitations. I can do in one of the NovaSeqs, the big, which people may recognize, over 36 hours. I can do probably about 288 tumor exomes or close to 800 germline exomes in a 36-hour period. I can probably do about 48 genomes. That's only going to be cost effective if it's full. If it's not, it isn't. And the cost goes up exponentially. So we don't live in an ecosystem where that really happens. Talk about silos. We'd be breaking down, We need to be incredible. The system we need to be more efficient, but certainly for health systems. And I've been part of an academic health system for most of my life. If you go there, most of them go in and have multiple sequencing laboratories throughout their system, some for every different specialty, and then turn out sending all their work out to a commercial laboratory where all they get back is a PDF and can't use any data. None of it really makes sense.
I want to pick up one of the questions that came in from the Q&A, and then I have a follow-up question to that thread you were just on, Mark. But and this might be for you, Mark. It's would like to know the panel's opinion on DTC genomic test panels and the future of validating these panels. For example, in NIPT, there are 76 genotypes looked at, but only few of clinical utility. Yeah.
In my old life, we offered a lot of those tests over there. We have moved progressively, and quite frankly, the FDA has approved certain tests to be offered on DTC. Everyone has their own opinion about it, and the value of it. It has become accepted, certainly, in a lot of applications that are out there. I'm probably not on the side of having been the most proactive in those areas. I still think of myself more as a clinician than anything else. But increasingly, there's going to be more of a demand, and there'll be more of that for individual needs that people will go have. Will it have an impact that it will change? Do I think it'll have an impact that's going to really change the needle? I'm not really sure, because as I say, a lot of what's being done right now are genotyping, not sequencing-based tests that are limited information, and you're skewing much more to normal ones. In terms of the other issue, is actually an interesting issue about NIPT and about a lot of the work that's being done, because in the clinical lab business that I was in, people are competing. And you go in and you offer panels. And you say, I'm going to do one that's going to have 25 genes. No, 50 genes. No, 100. No, 500, whatever it's going to be. And ultimately, you get to the point of where the difference in cost doesn't mean anything. And physicians may not know what to do with it. So the value is not the clinical value of what you may do. The real value is that which is being ignored, which is that someone has, whether it be the patient, the healthcare provider, what have you, potentially has the access to that information that has a real value. For the work that I have with my colleagues on the phone, you go in and you look at tests all the time for clinical subjects, even though it's early, and you look at that and you get back results for patients for whatever you're looking for. And think about, with the added consent, how much more value would you have if you were able to get more information, more parts, not just the targets or those specific tests? It's functionally not effective, and the cost is should be no different, right? Same thing that's run. That was always a frustration that bothered me, is that there was this incredible untapped value. The things that we're talking about, one of the real building blocks, is being done, and we can't use it. We don't have it. You're right. If it gets more inexpensive, we'll have more access. Yes. Is there going to be a benefit for it? I don't know who's going to get the benefit of that. And it's just not getting. It's just not getting.
I think that comes back to your comment about comments that we've made about the PDF document is the lingua franca right now of data exchange, as opposed to a view of how this data exists in a graph. So if our goal is to produce a form with a checkbox, yes, you have this, no, you don't, we're always going to be stuck in that. Everything else hits the cutting room floor. And if we want to preserve all the context, again, there's very, very low incremental cost of producing it, and it's valuable. We have to have a way of capturing it, of sharing it. Again, because people look at that, the cost of producing a PDF and emailing it to you is pennies. The cost of producing 20 gigabytes of data and sending it to you is dollars. And when your margins are very thin, again, we have to find a way. It goes back to Chris's point about what's the equivalent of a healthcare data market. What are the economics on it? Because you can store that for pennies, in a large scale web provider, but someone has to be willing to do the aggregation, the privacy preservation, the being able to go build something useful and index out of all that data that respects the consent of all the patients who contributed.
I agree. And it's all about, and you don't do it, it's not going to be the machines behind me. It's the informatic systems that are going to go enable what you do with the data. I couldn't agree with you more.
Kind of design an experiment to answer the immediate question, a very narrow question, but we don't design the experiment to also produce data that can be reused on kind of a secondary use basis. And today's secondary use basis is making data ready for feeding machine learning models, right? So what is today's test, learning data sets? Well, they don't really exist unless they're created. And so, some of the things we're thinking about is how to improve the data creation process so that we can, have that data that is more relevant and more, integratable by which to produce better models, better predictive capabilities. And so I think it's kind of I want to turn the crank, but I don't, I'm not thinking about how turning that crank, I can improve that turning of the crank in the future. And so we need to break that model as well.
Yep. No, that's great. It's a great discussion. And we're coming up on time, and I've got 11 more questions that I want to ask you guys, and I don't think we're going to have enough time to go through them all. But I do want to pick up, I guess, in closing, as we go around the horn, I want to pick up a question that came in on the Q&A as well. And it basically says, I feel like we've been having this discussion for a long time. Yeah. And why is it so hard, right? Who needs to be at the table? How can we make these changes happen faster? So I give you guys an opportunity to weigh in on that as you make your closing comments. And I'll start with Hal.
I think I do agree there's opportunity. I think it is a question of we're trying to create a multi-sided market. And again, I'll draw a weird analogy out of the technology space, the video game industry. So, if you want to start a new video game company today, you have two problems. One is you need to have games that people want to play. The second is you need to have people who have bought your console so the people developing the games have something to go sell to. And this is sort of our challenge right now is we're stuck in this loop of, well, people would put their data in it. People would contribute their data, the game, if you will, to the console if there was a market for it. And we're saying, well, there aren't enough consumers out there, so we don't have the producers, we don't have the consumers. How do we match them? I think it's going to take, Microsoft solved this very well. They built the Xbox, they created Halo, they shipped the two together. Instantly, everybody wanted Halo, so they bought the Xbox. They solved the problem. We need to find that moment where the producers and consumers, with economic interest and incentive, are joined together to go create that network effect. I don't think we have. I think it's again, the point we talked about silos and fragmentation. It is very fragmented.
So Mark, I'll go to you for your closing comments.
Silos and systems. We have to go get through both of them, silos and systems. It is just remarkable just how siloed it really is, and the data and the access to the data is. Systems who have data and access to data can't get their act together to go do it. They're afraid by financial costs. They have to deal with their own organization to do it. We had the first commercial next-gen panel in a laboratory. I bought the lab because of this idea of working in an area called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. At the time in 05, 06, the only way we did genetic testing was doing Sanger sequencing, meaning saying, do you have this variant? Do you have this gene? And for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it was a great clinical case where it wasn't the gene, it was a different question. Do you have this clinical condition, and what genes could contribute to that? For a little bit different, which changed, and it went from there to do more and more and more there. Now let's go look at where we are now, 15, 16 years later. Look how much money has been spent by pharma companies for drugs that are addressing issues of both hypertrophic, meaning really thick, or dilated cardiomyopathies, right? And almost the biggest challenge for them is to go find patients who have these. This is not only genetic, it's also clinical. So it's amazing about how far we've come with solutions, and still how far we have to be able to go in and find the full leverage and value of this. Silos and systems. We can do okay with the systems. We've done better with it. Silos is still there.
Fair comment. And John, bring us to a close.
Yeah, I think just piling on to those themes, and I think it's alignment of incentives, if I were to pick out that phrase. I'm reminded. I was actually at Accenture back in the mid 2000s when electronic health records were kind of in the early phases of their hype cycle, and when there was going to be a connected network of data that would be coming from electronic medical records. How would we connect that, and how would the pharma industry benefit? And so what were those use cases? And of course, we could identify, signal detection for safety and pharmacovigilance. We can identify, ways to find patients to put on clinical trials through their clinical profile in their electronic health record. But there's still silos to take advantage of those capabilities. So that hype cycle hasn't played out, whether it's the electronic health record, but also the combination of genetic. And so kind of able to, and perhaps, what's missing is alignment of incentives I've heard over the years this argument, well, if we just bring all our data together in one place, when I'm having that discussion and say, well, that's never going to happen. Rather, it's always going to be in an ecosystem. And in fact, it should be, because you have to manage very diverse and different data. Continued investment and thinking about this connecting across an ecosystem of data and investing in that semantic layer, whether it's technology or in just each collaboration partners and trust on how to share that data. That's where we need to invest. There's my closing thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you all. We're right at the top of the hour, right on time. So I want to thank you all. I think you're right. We've only begun to scratch the surface of the power that we're going to unleash once we are able to pull the data together in meaningful ways and start analyzing it and using it in anger. So I want to thank all of you guys for your opinions today and a fantastic discussion, and thank all of the attendees for attending, and have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.